The diplomatic communique from the Velhari hegemony arrived at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday that it was formal, precisely worded, transmitted on the standard interstellar diplomatic frequency that humanity had only recently learned to monitor. It said, in summary, the Velhari hegemony wished to inform the Human Unified Space Authority that a navigational error had resulted in an unscheduled landing of a hegemony diplomatic vessel in human-designated territory, specifically in a field approximately 4 kilometers outside the town of Ashford, in the county of Kent, in the nation-state of England, on the planet Earth. The hegemony wished to retrieve its vessel and its crew at the earliest possible opportunity. The hegemony trusted that the Human Unified Space Authority would facilitate a prompt and professional resolution of this matter. The response from Earth came back 47 minutes later. Not from the Unified Space Authority, from the town of Ashford, Kent, specifically from a woman named Margaret Holloway, 63 years old, retired schoolteacher, who had been the first person on the scene when the ship came down in Ted Barrow's wheat field, and who had, in the 47 minutes between the ship's landing and the hegemony's communique, made tea for all 11 members of the crew, established that 3 of them had minor injuries requiring first aid, dressed said injuries with the competence of someone who had raised 4 children and taught secondary school for 31 years, and determined that the ship's navigation system would require at minimum 3 days of repairs before it could safely depart. Her response said, "They're fine. We're looking after them. Take your time." The Velhari hegemony read this response, then read it again, then convened an emergency diplomatic session to determine what, exactly, was happening on the planet Earth. What happened in Ted Barrow's field, the navigational error that brought the Velhari diplomatic vessel Serene Accord down in Ted Barrow's wheat field was, by the assessment of the hegemony's Navigation Review Board, the result of a cascade failure in the tertiary guidance system during an atmospheric calibration sequence that should not have been running during active navigation, and which was only running because a junior navigation officer had initiated a maintenance protocol at a moment when his supervisor was on a meal break. The Serene Accord was a mid-sized diplomatic vessel, not a warship. It carried no weapons systems beyond the standard defensive array required by interstellar insurance regulations. Its crew of 11 included Ambassador Drathvel, his diplomatic staff of 4, a navigation team of 3, 2 maintenance engineers, and 1 junior communications officer who was on his first deep space posting and who would spend the rest of his career dining out on this story. The landing was not graceful. The Serene Accord came through Earth's atmosphere at an angle that the navigation team would later describe as suboptimal, and set down in Ted Barrow's wheat field at a speed that left a furrow approximately 40 meters long and destroyed roughly a quarter of what had, until that morning, been a very promising crop. The crew were shaken. Ambassador Drathvel had a bruised upper limb from where he'd been thrown against a navigation console. 2 staff members had similar minor injuries. The ship's power systems were nominal, but the navigation array was, as the senior engineer assessed within 20 minutes of landing, going to need significant work. They were, in the assessment of everyone aboard, in a difficult situation. They were on an alien world. A world that had only recently become aware of interstellar civilization. A world whose inhabitants had not, to the hegemony's knowledge, previously had direct contact with Velhari species. A world that was, in the xenobiological classification system, a death world, which meant that the immediate environment outside the ship might contain any number of lethal biological or chemical hazards. Ambassador Drathvel, who had 20 years of diplomatic experience and had navigated more difficult situations than this one, assessed the circumstances and made a decision that he opened the hatch. Not because he was reckless, because the ship's atmospheric sensors confirmed that the external environment was breathable. The oxygen content was higher than ideal, but within survivable parameters, and because staying sealed in a damaged ship on an alien world with no communication established seemed, on balance, more dangerous than making contact. He opened the hatch. He found Margaret Holloway standing in the wheat field, holding a tray. On the tray were 11 cups of tea and a plate of biscuits. Margaret Holloway had been born in Ashford, Kent, had lived in Ashford, Kent, for 63 years, and had developed, over 6 decades of managing classrooms full of adolescents and a household full of her own children, a particular philosophy of crisis management. The philosophy was, first, assess the situation. Second, determine what the immediate needs are. Third, address those needs. Panic, drama, and extended deliberation could wait until the immediate needs were handled. She had been having her morning tea in her garden when the serene accord came down. She had watched it, with the particular calm of someone who has learned that most remarkable things turn out to have explanations, cross the sky and disappear behind the tree line in the direction of Ted's field. She had put the kettle on. Then she had walked the 4 kilometers to Ted's field. She walked 4 kilometers every morning anyway. It was good for her hip, and found the ship, the furrow, and 11 beings of a species she had never seen before who were clearly shaken and possibly injured and a long way from home. She had assessed the situation. She had determined the immediate needs. She had gone back home and made tea by the time Ambassador Drathvel opened the hatch. She had been waiting for 11 minutes and was not remotely concerned about waiting longer. The ambassador looked at her. She looked at the ambassador. Velhari were tall, nearly 2.5 meters, silver-skinned, four-armed, with vertical eyelids and a sensory crest that ran from their forehead to the back of their skull. Margaret noted all of this with the attention of someone who had spent 30 years noticing things about the beings in front of her. "Hello," she said. "You look like you've had a rough morning. I've brought tea. I wasn't sure what you'd take in it, so I've brought milk and sugar separately. And there are biscuits. They're digestives, which are very good for settling the stomach, in my experience." Ambassador Drathvel had 19 years of diplomatic training. He had protocols for first contact situations. He had formal greetings prepared in 17 languages. He looked at the trade. He looked at Margaret Holloway, he said, in the automatic translation rendered by his suit's language system, which had been quietly processing English from Earth's radio transmissions for 18 months. "Thank you." "Lovely," said Margaret. "Now, has anyone been hurt? I've got a first aid kit." The first 3 hours word spread in Ashford the way word spreads in small English towns. Not quickly, not with the dramatic speed of news in larger places. With the particular thoroughness of a community where everyone knew everyone and information moved through networks of genuine personal connection rather than broadcast, by the time the Unified Space Authority's response team was scrambled, which took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Because the relevant department had never actually had to scramble for a first contact situation on British soil, and the protocols were somewhat theoretical, the following had already occurred. Ted Barrow had arrived in his field, assessed the damage to his wheat, and, upon meeting Ambassador Drathvel, had expressed sympathy about the navigation error, offered the opinion that these things happen, and invited the crew to use his barn as a shelter while repairs were assessed. That Ted's wife, Carol, had arrived with a proper lunch, sandwiches, crisps, fruit, and a flask of soup, because she felt that tea and biscuits, while a good start, were not a meal. The doctor, Priya Patel from the Ashford medical practice, had been called and had arrived with her bag, examined the injured crew members with professional thoroughness and genuine curiosity, dressed the injuries, and declared that while she was not a xenobiologist and couldn't be certain her assessment was complete, nothing appeared immediately life-threatening. The local vicar, Father Michael Okafor, had arrived because he had heard there were visitors and felt visitors should be welcomed. 7 children between the ages of 8 and 14 had arrived because the ship was genuinely extraordinary, and parents in Ashford had long since learned that trying to keep curious children away from extraordinary things was a project with a very poor success rate. Ambassador Drathvel sat in Ted Barrow's barn, eating what the translation system informed him was called a prawn sandwich, surrounded by the most informal diplomatic situation of his career, and found himself doing something he had not expected to do on this mission. Having a conversation, not a formal exchange, not a diplomatic dialogue with prepared positions and negotiated language, a conversation. The kind that happened when people were in a barn together eating lunch, and one of the children had questions about what stars looked like from space, and the ambassador found, to his surprise, that he wanted to answer what the hegemony wanted. The Velhari hegemony's diplomatic response team arrived at Earth's orbital interface 36 hours after the Serene Accord's landing. They were not a rescue mission. The Serene Accord's crew were, by all available reports, in good health and being well cared for. They were a retrieval and resolution team, tasked with extracting the vessel and crew, managing the diplomatic fallout of an unscheduled first contact, and minimizing the reputational and political damage to the hegemony that came from having one of its diplomatic vessels end up in a wheat field on a death world. The team's lead diplomat, Senior Envoy Geith Khan, had read the available reports on the situation before departure. He had read them with increasing unease, not because anything in them suggested harm to the crew. Everything suggested the opposite. The crew were, by Ambassador Drathvel's own communications, comfortable, fed, medically attended to, and the word the ambassador had used, which Geith Khan had read 3 times trying to determine if the translation was accurate, enjoying themselves. The unease came from a different source, from the fact that in 36 hours, the humans of Ashford, Kent had managed to create a situation that the hegemony's diplomatic protocols had absolutely no framework for. The crew were not being held. They were not prisoners. They had the freedom to return to the ship at any time and had chosen, repeatedly, not to. The ship's repairs were proceeding. The hegemony's engineers had transmitted assistance via the communications link, but slowly. Not because the work was difficult. Because the Serene Accord's engineering team kept stopping to answer questions from a rotating cast of local residents who found the technology genuinely fascinating and whose questions, the engineers reported, were often surprisingly insightful. Ambassador Drathvel had given, by Geith Khan's count, for informal presentations to local residents about Velhari culture. One tour of the Serene Accord to a group that included both Margaret Holloway and 7 children, and had attended what the translation system described as a village pub quiz on the previous evening, during which his team had. The ambassador's report used the phrase, acquitted themselves reasonably well. Placed 3rd out of 12 teams that Geith Khan read this. He read it again. Then he sent a communication to the Unified Space Authority requesting formal diplomatic protocols for the retrieval process. The response came from the Unified Space Authority's newly activated First Contact Office, which had been operational for approximately 26 hours and whose director had not slept in 36. The response said, in summary, we're working on it. In the meantime, please be assured that the crew are being well looked after. Geith Khan composed his reply carefully. We appreciate the care being extended to our crew. We wish to begin the formal retrieval process at the earliest possible opportunity. Could you advise on a timeline for the crew's return to the vessel and the vessel's departure clearance? The response, when it came, was not from the First Contact Office. It was from Margaret Holloway. The ambassador has been invited to the Ashford Community Festival this Saturday. He said he'd like to attend. The ship should be ready to depart Sunday. Is that all right? Geith Khan stared at his screen. Then he sent a message to the hegemony's Foreign Affairs Ministry that began, the situation on Earth is more complicated than anticipated. The festival, the Ashford Community Festival, happened every year, had happened every year for 47 years, and was not going to be cancelled or rescheduled because a Velhari diplomatic vessel had landed in Ted Barrow's field. If anything, the festival committee, a body of 8 people whose dedication to the annual event was the kind that historians write about, felt that the presence of genuine extraterrestrial visitors was an enhancement to the program rather than a complication. The festival had stalls. It had local produce and handmade goods and a competition for the best Victoria sponge that Margaret Holloway had won 4 times and intended to win again. It had a brass band. It had a dog show. It had, this year, a Velhari diplomatic delegation of 11, who moved through the festival with the particular expression of beings who had been trained for formal diplomatic contexts and had found themselves, instead, at a village fair in Kent. Ambassador Drathvel ate a toffee apple. His expression, as recorded by the 17,000 photographs taken by local residents and subsequently uploaded to Earth's communications networks where they reached 400 million viewers in 22 hours, was one that transcended species. The universal look of someone tasting something unexpectedly wonderful. Junior Communications Officer Vithnar, on his first deep space posting, who had been quietly overwhelmed by the entire experience, entered the dog show with a terrier borrowed from Carol Barrow, on the grounds that he had been told participation was welcome and the terrier seemed enthusiastic. He placed second. He accepted the rosette with an expression that the hegemony's Foreign Affairs Ministry would later describe, in an internal report, as diplomatically suboptimal, but personally understandable. Senior engineer Prax D spent 4 hours at the craft stalls, purchasing items with a focus and dedication that suggested she was either a passionate collector of earth handcraft or conducting a systematic material science assessment. Possibly both. And Margaret Holloway won the Victoria Sponge competition for the 5th time, accepted her ribbon with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had expected nothing less, and then brought the winning cake to Ted Barrow's barn, where the Serene Accord's crew were having their evening meal, and shared it with them. Ambassador Drathvel, eating Victoria's sponge in a barn in Kent, sent his daily situation report to the hegemony.it was longer than usual.it covered, as required, the status of the vessel and the timeline for departure. It covered the medical status of the crew, all fully recovered. It covered the diplomatic interaction with human representatives. The first contact office was now properly operational and formal protocols were being established. And then it covered, in a section that was not required but that the ambassador felt compelled to include, I have been in diplomatic service for 20 years. I have represented the hegemony on 43 missions across 19 systems. I have attended formal state dinners with heads of government of 11 species. I have negotiated trade agreements, border settlements, and 3 separate armistice arrangements. I have not, before this week, attended a village festival in a wheat field on a death world and placed 3rd in a pub quiz. I want to be precise about what I observed this week, because I believe it is important for the hegemony's understanding of this species. The humans of Ashford, Kent did not treat us as extraordinary. They treated us as guests. There is a difference. Extraordinary things are held at a distance, observed, categorized. Guests are fed and given tea and invited to the festival and asked if we'd like to try the toffee apple. The result of being treated as guests rather than extraordinary things was that I learned more about this species in 5 days in a barn in Kent than the hegemony's entire xenological research program has produced in 18 months of remote observation. I recommend that the hegemony reconsider its approach to human engagement. They are remarkable, not in the ways we expected, not in the ways our death world classification suggested, in quieter ways, in the ways that a species is remarkable when it has been, for a very long time, practicing the specific skill of making other beings feel welcome. I think we should pay attention to that. What humanity did the Serene Accord was repaired and flight-ready by Sunday morning. As Margaret had predicted, the formal departure ceremony, arranged by the First Contact Office, with the particular speed of an organization that had been operational for 5 days and was learning as it went, was held in Ted Barrow's field. Representatives from the British government were present. Representatives from the Unified Space Authority were present. Cameras from 17 news organizations were present, along with approximately 400 residents of Ashford and surrounding areas who had heard the ceremony was happening and felt they should be there. Senior Envoy Geith Khan, who had arrived from the orbital interface to manage the formal departure, stood beside Ambassador Drathvel and prepared to deliver the hegemony's official statement, a carefully worded document that expressed appropriate regret for the unscheduled landing, appreciation for the hospitality extended, and confirmation of the hegemony's commitment to the developing diplomatic relationship with humanity. He delivered the statement. The First Contact Office's director, a woman named Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, who had not slept properly in 6 days and who was operating on professional competence and caffeine, delivered humanity's formal response, equally carefully worded, equally diplomatic. And then Margaret Holloway, who had not been scheduled to speak and who had attended the ceremony because she had baked a farewell cake and wanted to deliver it in person, stepped forward. She was not a diplomat. She had no prepared statement. She had a cake tin and 31 years of talking to people and knowing what needed to be said. "We'd like you to come back," she said, not into a microphone. She simply said it, in the direction of Ambassador Drathvel, in the tone she used when she meant something and wanted to be certain it was understood. Not just officially. Just come back. When you want to. You're welcome here. Ambassador Drathvel looked at her, at the field, at the furrow that was already being discussed in the Ashford Planning Committee as a potential heritage site, at the 400 people who had come to say goodbye to 11 beings they had known for 5 days, as if they were seeing off friends. He said something in Velhari that his translation system rendered as, "We will." And then, because it seemed right, he accepted the cake, The part nobody expected 3 weeks after the Serene Accord's departure. The Velhari Hegemony's Foreign Affairs Ministry received a communication from the Unified Space Authority. It was not a complaint, not a demand, not the kind of communication that typically followed an unscheduled landing on an inhabited world. It was a proposal. The Unified Space Authority proposed the establishment of a formal cultural exchange program between Earth and the Velhari Hegemony. Not a diplomatic exchange, they had that. Not a trade exchange, that was being negotiated separately. A cultural exchange. Specifically, the program would involve Velhari citizens spending time on Earth, in communities, with families, doing ordinary things. And humans doing the same in Velhari space. Not observers. Not researchers. Guests. The proposal included, as supporting documentation, the footage from the Ashford Community Festival, Ambassador Drathvel's situation reports, Dr. Patel's medical notes on the crew's recovery, the pub quiz results, and a photograph. Junior Communications Officer Vithnar, holding a second-place rosette from the Ashford Dog Show, standing next to a very pleased-looking terrier and an 8-year-old child who had appointed herself as festival guide and who was grinning with the complete, uncomplicated happiness of someone who has had a perfect day. The Hegemony's Foreign Affairs Ministry read the proposal. They looked at the photograph. They sent the proposal to the Cultural Relations Committee, the Diplomatic Review Board, and the Species Integration Office, all of whom had opinions. The opinions were lengthy, detailed, and complicated. The decision, in the end, was simple: yes. 6 months later, the first cohort of Velhari exchange participants, 12 individuals, selected from a pool of 4,000 applicants, which the Hegemony's Cultural Relations Committee had found both surprising and instructive, arrived on Earth on a Thursday. They were not diplomats, not researchers, not military personnel. They were a schoolteacher, an engineer, a musician, a chef, 2 students, a retired administrator named Golfine, who had spent 40 years in the Hegemony's Infrastructure Management Division and who had applied for the exchange program because his grandchildren had told him he needed to do something interesting, and he had decided, at the age of what translated to approximately 80 human years, that they were probably right. They were distributed across 7 countries, in 7 communities, with 7 host families, for 3 months. No diplomatic protocols, no formal observation schedules, no research objectives, just live here for a while. See what it's like. Golfine was placed with a family in Osaka, Japan. The Kimura family, grandmother, parents, 2 children aged 9 and 14, received him with the particular combination of genuine welcome and careful courtesy that characterized Japanese hospitality at its best. They had prepared a room for him, adapted as well as they could for Velhari physiology, and had spent 2 weeks researching what he could eat, how Velhari communication worked, and what cultural courtesies they should be aware of. They had also, the 9-year-old had decided on her own initiative, made a sign for his room that said "Welcome Home" in both Japanese, and what she had determined, through considerable research, was the closest Velhari written equivalent. Golfine stood in the doorway of the room they'd prepared for him and looked at the sign. He had managed the infrastructure of 3 Hegemony star systems. He had overseen projects that had housed millions of beings. He had been, in the assessment of every professional review of his career, exceptionally competent. He had never, in 80 years of life, had someone make him a sign. He said something in Velhari that the translation device rendered as, "Thank you." This is, "Thank you." The 9-year-old, whose name was Hannah, nodded with the serious satisfaction of someone whose project had achieved its objective. "We wanted you to feel like it was home," she said, "even though you're far away from home." Golfine looked at her. He thought about what Ambassador Drathvel had written in his situation report. Guests rather than extraordinary things. A species that has been, for a very long time, practicing the specific skill of making other beings feel welcome. He understood it now, in a way he hadn't from reading it. "It does," he said. "It does feel like home." What the 12 reported. The 12 Velhari exchange participants submitted individual reports at the end of their 3-month placement. The Cultural Relations Committee read all 12. Then read them again. Then commissioned a comparative analysis, because the reports shared certain themes that the committee found both striking and difficult to categorize. All 12 reported variations on the same core experience, not the food, though several reports mentioned food with an enthusiasm that the committee found simultaneously understandable and mildly alarming. Not the technology, though Earth's particular combination of advanced capability in some areas and cheerful improvisation in others had produced observations ranging from admiring to baffled. The consistent theme was something harder to quantify. Every one of the 12 had experienced, at some point in their 3 months, a moment where they had been in difficulty, confused, lost, linguistically stranded, culturally uncertain, homesick, and where a human had noticed and helped. Not because it was their job, not because of diplomatic obligation or institutional mandate, because they had noticed someone having a hard time and had decided to do something about it. The chef, placed in Cape Town, South Africa, had gotten completely lost on the public transport system on his second day. A woman he had never met had spent 45 minutes of her own journey time helping him find his way, refused any acknowledgement of the inconvenience this caused her, and given him her phone number in case he got lost again. The musician, placed in Nashville, Tennessee, had mentioned in a community meeting that she played an instrument. By the following week, she had been invited to join 3 different informal music groups, none of whom cared that she was from a different species, and all of whom cared very much that she could keep time. The 2 students, placed with university families in Edinburgh and Mumbai, had both reported being absorbed into social networks, study groups, sports teams, weekend activities, within the first 2 weeks, with a speed and completeness that neither had anticipated. Golfine's report was the longest. It covered his 3 months with the Kimura family in detail. The meals, the conversations, the 9-year-old Hannah's decision, in month 2, to teach him origami because she felt everyone should know origami. The 14-year-old's questions about hegemony infrastructure that had started as polite conversation and developed into a 3-week ongoing discussion that the boy was apparently using as the basis for a school project. The grandmother, who spoke no Velhari and whose translator rendered her Japanese into his language with occasional creative interpretations, who had nonetheless managed to communicate across every language barrier, that she was glad he was there. The final paragraph of Golf Veen's report read, "I spent 40 years managing infrastructure. I understand systems. I understand how things connect and what holds them together and what happens when the connections fail. I did not, before this assignment, have an adequate model for what I observed in this species. They connect, persistently, instinctively, across every barrier, language, biology, culture, the fact that I am from a different star system and look nothing like them and eat different things and have different customs. They connect anyway. They find the common thing and they build on it. The 9-year-old taught me origami, not because it was useful, because she wanted to give me something that was hers, and that was what she had. I have been thinking about this for 3 months, about what produces that impulse in a species, about what kind of world, what kind of history, makes a being decide that the right response to a stranger is to give them something. Earth is classified as a death world. I knew this before I arrived. I understood it as a statement about environmental hostility, about the severity of the conditions that shaped this species. I understand it differently now. A world that's severe, a world that hard, requires cooperation to survive. It requires the specific skill of building connection across difference, because the difference doesn't matter when the storm is coming and you need the person next to you to hold the line. They learned to connect because they had to, and then they kept doing it, long after they had to, because it had become who they are. I have a standing invitation to return to Osaka. I intend to accept it. What the hegemony asked for. 8 months after the Serene Accords landing, the Velhari hegemony's Foreign Affairs Ministry sent a formal diplomatic communication to the Unified Space Authority. It was, on the surface, a routine matter. The formal conclusion of the first cultural exchange cohort's placement, administrative confirmation of the program's continuation, scheduling for the second cohort. At the end of the communication, almost as a footnote, the ministry included a request. The request was for the return of Golfine. Not because his placement had ended, it had. He had returned to Velhari space as scheduled. The request was for his return to his previous administrative post, which he had vacated to participate in the exchange program, and which his department very much wanted him back in. Golfine had submitted a counterproposal. He wished to remain involved in the cultural exchange program. Specifically, he wished to be assigned as the hegemony's resident liaison coordinator for the Earth program. a role that would require him to spend approximately 6 months of each year on Earth, working with host families and exchange participants and the program's administrative infrastructure. The ministry had forwarded his counterproposal to the Cultural Relations Committee. The Cultural Relations Committee had noted that Golfveen was 80 years old, was one of the most experienced infrastructure administrators in the hegemony, and was proposing to spend half his remaining career helping aliens feel at home on a death world. They had also noted that his report on the exchange experience had been the most read internal document in the ministry's history, and that when they had contacted the Kimura family to confirm the administrative details of Golfveen's placement, the 9-year-old Hannah had sent a separate communication addressed directly to the Cultural Relations Committee, which said, "Please let him come back. We're not finished with the origami. He still hasn't learned the crane." The Cultural Relations Committee approved Golfveen's counterproposal. They also, in a footnote of their own, noted that the Kimura family's communication should be filed under supporting documentation in the program records. The footnote said, "This child's communication is, in our assessment, the clearest single explanation of what makes this program worth continuing. She is not finished. She wants to keep teaching. She assumes, without question, that the appropriate response to someone leaving is to give them a reason to come back. This is, we believe, what Ambassador Drathvel meant. This is what a death world produces. Not just survivors. People who refuse to let go of the connections they've made." Ted Barrow's field, 1 year later. The furrow the Serene Accord had left in Ted Barrow's wheat field was, 1 year later, a garden. Not officially a heritage site. The planning committee had discussed it and decided that a heritage site required more paperwork than anyone wanted to deal with. But a garden, planted by the community, maintained by a rotating roster of volunteers that included, on their visits to Earth, 3 members of the Serene Accord's original crew who had specifically requested placement in the Ashford area for the second cohort exchange. Margaret Holloway tended her section of it on Tuesday and Friday mornings after her walk. The garden had a bench. The bench had a small plaque installed by the Ashford Community Committee with the particular low-key affection of a community that doesn't make a fuss but knows when something matters. The plaque said, "Here, on a Tuesday in spring, 11 travelers came down in Ted's wheat field. We made them tea. They came back." Underneath, in Velhari script that Ambassador Drathvel had provided when he was asked, was the same sentiment in his language. Margaret sat on the bench on a Tuesday morning and drank her tea and looked at the garden. Her translation device, she'd got one 6 months ago because it turned out to be genuinely useful, rendered the Velhari text for her each time she sat here, though she knew it by now without needing the translation. It said, "The welcome was real. We knew it was real. That is why we came back." She drank her tea. In the distance, the sound of a shuttle, the regular Earth Velhari exchange transport ran weekly now, out of Heathrow, crossed the sky overhead. She looked up, waved, on the general principle that you should wave at things that might wave back. Then she finished her tea, stood up, and walked home. She had a second cohort welcome dinner to prepare. There were 11 of them this time. She was going to need more biscuits. They landed in a wheat field by mistake, and the first human on the scene made them tea. Not because she had diplomatic training, not because she had protocols, because someone was clearly having a rough morning, and that's what you do when someone is having a rough morning. You make them tea. You dress their injuries. You invite them to the festival on Saturday, and when they leave, you tell them to come back. Because that is what humans do. Not just survive the death world. Not just outlast the predators and the storms and the gravity and the impossible odds. We make a home of it, and then we offer that home to everyone who stumbles into it. Even when they come down in your wheat field. Even when they don't look like you. Even when they're from a different star. We make them tea, and we mean it when we say, "You're welcome here." Subscribe to Humans Hit Different for more HFY stories that remind you what humanity really is. New stories dropping regularly. The galaxy keeps discovering us, and we keep surprising it. Bell subscribe. Put the kettle on. There's always room for one more.